Christmas Angel. I woke up that cold December morning with a lump in my throat. It was still early, just before the sun had come up, and I could hear the soft shuffling of little feet on the wooden floor. My youngest, Tommy, was only 3 months old, and his cries had already started. The others, Billy, age 6, Charlie, 7, and Emma, 2, were still snuggled under the blankets, but not for long. They never slept much once the day began. The house was still dark, and the air had a chill that made my breath fog in the room. The house hadn't been warm in weeks. I didn't have much, but I had them, my children, my reason for everything. But that was the problem, wasn't it? My reason for living was also the very thing that left me feeling so desperate. Ben, their father, had left us the night before. He had been more of a shadow than a real presence in our lives. But when he decided to leave, it was the final blow. The kids had grown used to the sound of his truck pulling into the driveway, his voice booming through the house, and the tension that followed. They never knew when his mood would turn violent, but they learned to hide. They learned to bury themselves under blankets, under tables, anywhere they could. But now he was gone, and with him went the $15 he used to leave behind every week for groceries. I wiped away a tear as I nursed Tommy. I couldn't cry, not now. Not when there was so much to do. I had 6 mouths to feed and no way to do it. I knew that in Copper Hill, there was no welfare system. At least not one I knew of. There was no safety net to catch me. There was only the cold reality of having to fight for every scrap. I put Tommy down in the crib and quietly shuffled around, trying not to wake the others. I'd have to make them breakfast soon, but I had nothing to make it with. The pantry was bare except for a few cans of beans that had been sitting there too long, their labels peeling. The sight of those cans was enough to make me feel sick. I couldn't feed them beans every day. I took a deep breath. No time to dwell on that. I had to get to work, and that meant finding a job. Fast. I had a plan in my mind, though I didn't know if it would work. I scrubbed the kids as best as I could, combing their tangled hair, putting on their worn but clean clothes. The boys grumbled as I pulled on their shirts and pants, but they didn't argue. They were too tired. And so was I. Once they were dressed, I put on my best homemade dress. It was threadbare, patched in places, but it was the best I had. I couldn't afford new clothes. Not now, not ever. But I would put on this dress and face the world, even if it meant swallowing every bit of my pride. We all piled into our old 1949 Plymouth, the one Ben had left behind with its rusted-out fenders and worn-out tires. The car creaked and groaned as we made our way into town. I tried to stay calm, to focus on the task at hand, but as I drove past the familiar streets, my stomach twisted. I could see the looks people would give me when they saw my car, my children, the state of us. But I pushed that thought out of my mind. I couldn't afford to think like that. First stop, the factory. I had heard they might be hiring, though I wasn't sure what kind of work I could do. I pulled the car into the parking lot, and the kids sat quietly, watching as I got out. "I'll be right back," I said, trying to sound confident. The kids nodded, though I could see the worry in their eyes. I gave them a reassuring smile, but I wasn't sure I believed it myself. I walked into the factory office, my heart pounding in my chest. The manager, a large man with thick glasses, looked me up and down. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone cold. "I'm looking for work," I said. "Anything you have." "I can do anything." He paused, then shook his head. "Sorry, lady. We don't have anything right now." I was about to leave when he added, "Maybe next month. Come back then." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Thank you," I said softly, before turning on my heel and walking out the door. Back at the car, I could see the kids peering out the windows. I put on a brave face and smiled as I got in. But inside, I was starting to lose hope. We drove to the store next, and then the restaurant, and then another factory. I must have stopped at 5 places before lunch, each time with the same result. No openings. The kids had been so quiet, and I couldn't tell if they were hopeful or scared. I couldn't tell if they understood the weight of what I was doing, but I could feel it, heavy in my chest, like a stone that just kept growing. By the time we hit the last place in town, a small diner that I had heard might need help, I was running on fumes. I pulled into the lot, feeling like I was at the end of my rope. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't give up. "Mom, are we going to get a job?" Billy asked, his eyes wide with concern. "I don't know, Billy. I hope so." I got out of the car, my legs shaky. I couldn't keep doing this. But I had to. I had to try. I went inside, and the bell above the door jingled as I stepped in. The place smelled like coffee and fried food, the kind of place truckers stopped for a quick bite. I looked around, scanning the empty booths. The woman behind the counter, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, didn't look up at first. But when she saw me, she raised an eyebrow. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for work," I said. "Anything? I can do anything." She eyed me for a moment, her face unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "You can start tonight. Graveyard shift. 11 to 7. 65 cents an hour." I didn't care how little it was. I didn't care that it was late hours. It was a job. And that's all that mattered. "I'll take it," I said, trying to hold back the tears of relief that threatened to spill. It was nearing dusk when we reached the outskirts of Copper Hill. The streets had emptied, the town settling into its quiet evening routine. My old Plymouth creaked and groaned under the weight of the kids and my desperation. We had already been turned down at every job I could think of, and as we passed the familiar sights of the town, my hopes seemed to shrink with each mile. But there was one last place, a little farther out, that I hadn't checked yet. I wasn't sure if it would be any different, but at that point, I was willing to try anything. "Mom, where are we going now?" Emma, my 2-year-old, asked from the backseat, her tiny voice filled with curiosity. "We're going to see if we can find a job, sweetie." "It's going to be okay," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. I glanced at the other kids in the rearview mirror. They were quiet, each one with their own worries hidden behind tired eyes. The old root beer barrel had once been a popular drive-in, a place where teenagers in the 50s had parked their cars for burgers and shakes. Now it was a truck stop. The neon sign flickered on, casting a soft, blue glow across the dirt parking lot as we pulled up. I could already feel the weight of the night pressing on me. The cold air hit me when I opened the car door, and I shivered as I stepped out. "Here goes nothing," I muttered under my breath. The children stayed in the car, quiet and watchful, their faces pressed against the windows as I walked up to the diner. Inside, the warmth of the place enveloped me. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air. The low hum of conversation and the clink of dishes created a sense of familiarity, like a strange but comforting refuge. Behind the counter stood an older woman, her graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her hands were busy wiping down the counter. Her eyes flicked up to me, and for a moment I felt exposed under her gaze. It wasn't a judgmental look, but one that seemed to see right through me, as though she could tell exactly what I was feeling, the weight of 6 children and no way to provide for them. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm looking for work. Anything you might have available." "I can do anything." The woman set down the cloth she was holding and gave me a long, assessing look. She took her time, as if considering me, before finally speaking. "You're a little late for the lunch rush," she said with a small smile, "but I've got a graveyard shift open. Starts at 11 p.m., goes until 7 a.m. 65 cents an hour. I blinked, my heart racing at the offer. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a lifeline. "I'll take it," I said, my voice coming out stronger than I expected. I didn't care that the hours were brutal. I didn't care that the pay was barely enough to cover a few meals. What mattered was that this was a job, and right now that was all I needed. She studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "All right then. You'll start tonight. The name's Granny May. I run this place. We don't have much, but we keep things running around here. You're welcome to take a seat while you wait for the shift. Granny May's kindness was unexpected, a small glimmer of hope when I had all but given up. I thanked her quietly, my words barely making it past my lips. I couldn't believe it. I had a job. And with that, I turned back to the car, where the kids were still waiting, as quietly as ever. The drive back home was slow, the engine sputtering in protest as we made our way to our little house. My thoughts were already racing, trying to figure out the next steps. The job was a blessing, but I needed a solution for the kids. There was no way I could leave them alone at night. But I didn't have anyone to watch them, not unless I could figure something out. That's when I remembered Clara. She lived a few houses down, a teenager who'd been babysitting for families in the neighborhood for years. I didn't know her well, but I had seen her often enough to know that she was responsible. And maybe, just maybe, she would help me. I grabbed a few coins from my purse and went to the payphone. It felt like my hands were shaking as I dialed the number. I had nothing to offer her except my gratitude and the tips I'd earn. But I had to ask. Hello? Clara's voice was sweet and light, though I could hear the faint hum of a television in the background. Clara, it's me, Lucy, down the street. I was wondering if you could do me a favor. I've got a job at Ma's roadside diner, but it's the graveyard shift, and I don't have anyone to watch the kids. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could hear Clara's thoughts as she considered the request. I don't know, Lucy. That's pretty late, and I've got school in the morning. I understand, I said quickly, but it's the only job I could find, and I don't have anyone else to turn to. I'll pay you $1 a night. I know it's not much, but it's all I have. You can come over in your pajamas after the kids are asleep. I'll make sure they're settled, and you can sleep on the couch. Please, Clara. I just need someone to help. I held my breath, waiting for her answer. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. Okay, I'll do it. But just for $1, that's a steal, you know. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Thank you, Clara. You have no idea what this means. Later that night, after I had fed the kids and put them to bed, Clara arrived, her hair still damp from the shower, wearing her pajamas as promised. She was quiet, but I could tell she was nervous, too. I wasn't sure how long it would take before she felt comfortable in my home, but she did her best. Don't worry about them, Clara said as I stood in the doorway, ready to leave. I'll take care of them. Go get some rest, Lucy. You deserve it. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I had a job, I had help, and for the first time in days I could breathe. The weeks that followed my first night at Ma's roadside diner were a blur of exhaustion, worn-out nerves, and fleeting moments of hope. The pay from the diner wasn't much, but it was something. Still, it wasn't enough to cover the bills that kept piling up. Every morning, I'd wake to the same grim reality. The house was cold, the kids were hungry, and the car, my lifeline, was falling apart. It felt like the world was working against me. The bills sat on the kitchen table, glaring at me in their oppressive silence. The electricity bill was overdue, and there was no money for the heating oil. I did my best to hide the worry from the kids, but sometimes when I'd glance at them, sitting at the table eating the last of the bread I had saved for the week, the weight of it all felt like too much to bear. But somehow, I kept going. There was no other choice. Every night after work, I'd come home to Clara, who was always there with a smile, even though I knew she was just a teenager trying to make it through school herself. She'd tuck the kids, and while I tried to scrape together what I could for a few hours of sleep before going back to work. One bitter cold morning, as I trudged to the car with Tommy in my arms, I noticed the tires again. The old Plymouth had been my constant companion, but its tires had been more like balloons than rubber, flat, leaky, barely able to get me from one place to another. I had to stop every single morning to fill them up with air. It was a ritual that wore on me, the sound of the air pump hissing in the quiet morning, the cold biting at my hands as I struggled to keep the car running. I tried to push the thought of the tires from my mind, but that morning, when I opened the back seat to load the kids in, something stopped me in my tracks. The car was different. Something had changed. I took a step closer, confused. There, in the back seat, were 4 brand new tires. I blinked, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mom, what's wrong?" Billy's voice brought me back to reality. He was standing beside me, looking up at me with wide eyes. I couldn't answer him right away. My breath caught in my throat. There were no notes, no explanations. Just 4 shiny, new tires, as if they had been placed there by some invisible hand. I looked around the empty parking lot, but there was no one in sight. No one to thank, no one to ask how or why. It didn't make sense. I felt a lump form in my throat. A miracle. That's what it was. A small, unexpected miracle. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a glimmer of hope. I didn't know who had left them, but I knew I needed to take advantage of this gift. That's when I thought of Mr. Carver. He was the local mechanic who ran the small garage in the corner of town. I had passed by his shop dozens of times and always wondered if he could help with the car. But I didn't have money for repairs, not after everything else that was going wrong. Still, I had to try. I carefully loaded the new tires into the trunk and drove the short distance to Mr. Carver's garage. I parked the Plymouth in front of his shop and knocked on the door. A few moments later, Mr. Carver appeared, wiping his hands on a rag. His face was creased with age and hard work, but there was a warmth in his eyes. "What's the problem, Lucy?" he asked, always kind, always ready to listen. "Mr. Carver, I found something in my car this morning. 4 brand new tires. No note, no explanation. I don't know what to make of it," I said, my voice tinged with disbelief. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Well, I can see they're brand new, all right. But you don't have the money to pay for mounting 'em, do you?" I sighed, looking at the tires in the trunk. "No, sir, I don't." He scratched his chin thoughtfully for a moment, then gave me a knowing look. "Well, I tell you what, I'll put those tires on for you. But you'll need to do something in return." My heart skipped a beat. "Anything? I'll do anything." "All right," he said with a smile that softened his weathered face. "You can clean my office. My back's been giving me trouble, and I haven't had time to scrub it down in weeks. You get it cleaned up, and I'll take care of the tires." I nodded immediately. Deal? I didn't know how long it would take me to clean Mr. Carver's office, but at that moment, it felt like the easiest thing in the world. I followed him into the back of the shop, where the small office was located. It was cramped, with piles of old paperwork stacked on the desk and grease stains on the floor. I had no idea how long it would take me to make it shine, but I was determined. As I set to work, scrubbing the floors and wiping down the dusty shelves, Mr. Carver got to work on the tires. His hands were quick, experienced. He had no need for instructions, just an old familiarity with the work he did. Hours passed, and I was so focused on the task at hand that I barely noticed how much time had gone by. My hands were sore and my back ached from bending over to scrub the floors, but there was something strangely satisfying about the work. I wasn't just doing it to pay for tires. I was doing it for my kids, for our future. By the time I finished the last corner of the office, the sun had long set, and the shop was quiet. Mr. Carver was just finishing up with the tires. "All done," he said, stepping back and wiping his hands on his rag. "Those tires should last you a good while. And your office, well, it looks like it could be in a magazine now." I couldn't help but laugh, exhausted but grateful. "Thank you, Mr. Carver. You have no idea what this means." He waved me off with a gruff chuckle. "It's the least I can do. You've got a lot on your plate, Lucy. Take care of those kids." As I drove home, the car felt like a new machine. The tires gripped the road firmly, and I didn't have to worry about stopping every morning to fill them up. It was a small thing, but it was enough to remind me that maybe, just maybe, there were good people out there, people who saw someone in need and chose to help. The car might have been roadworthy again, but so was I. And that night, I felt a peace I hadn't known in months. Perhaps, just perhaps, a Christmas miracle was starting to take shape. The days leading up to Christmas were a blur of cold mornings and even colder nights. It seemed as though time was racing ahead, and I couldn't catch my breath. The kids were excited, their little faces glowing with anticipation, but I had nothing to give them. Not a single dollar to spare for toys or treats. The bills, the repairs, the never-ending costs of feeding and clothing 6 kids. It all consumed my thoughts. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I could make Christmas special for them when I had nothing to give. The old toys I had were in worse shape than I realized. The stuffed animals had lost their fluff, and the plastic toys had begun to crack and chip. The boys' clothes were patched up so many times they looked more like a quilt than anything else. I felt a pang of guilt every time I looked at them in those worn-out clothes. They deserved so much more. They deserved to feel like other kids, to have a Christmas like everyone else seemed to be having. One afternoon, while the kids were playing quietly in the living room, I sat down with a needle and thread. The air in the house was cold, and the smell of the unfinished dinner simmered on the stove, but I had work to do. I pulled out the pile of pants, shirts, and jackets that had seen better days and began to sew. I wasn't a professional seamstress by any means, but I had learned how to patch and mend in my own way. With each stitch, I worked to make those clothes look a little better, a little more presentable. The boys' pants, already patched at the knees, needed more attention. The fabric was thin, and the patches were barely holding together. But I sewed them anyway, hoping they would last just a little longer. "It'll be all right," I whispered to myself, tying off the last knot. Then there was the matter of the toys. The small, faded plastic cars and trucks that had been left behind by other kids. I didn't know where they came from, but I'd seen them in the corner of the garage for weeks. They were old, broken, and most of them were missing wheels or had cracked bodies. But I didn't care. I had an idea. I gathered the toys together, washed them, and then went to the cupboard where I kept the old cans of paint. I had some leftover red paint and I thought, why not? I grabbed a brush and began to coat the toys, giving them a new, shiny look. The red paint covered the worn plastic, and while they weren't perfect, they were transformed. I painted a truck for Billy, a small doll for Emma, and a few more trucks for the boys. I knew it wasn't much, but it was all I could do. Once I was done, I carefully hid them in the basement, behind boxes of old clothes and extra supplies. I prayed the kids wouldn't go down there before Christmas Eve. I wasn't sure how long I could keep the secret, but I had to try. I wanted them to wake up on Christmas morning, their faces full of wonder, even if it was just for a moment. When I finished with the toys, I went to the kitchen and tried to prepare something that resembled a meal. The stove hummed, the smell of beans and rice filled the room, but it was nothing like the Christmas feasts I remembered from when I was a child. Still, I did my best. I looked at the kids as they played and laughed in the other room, and a bittersweet feeling washed over me. I had nothing to give them but love, and sometimes that seemed like it wasn't enough. The nights leading up to Christmas were the hardest. I worked at the diner until late, then came home to check on the kids and get them settled in bed. Clara, who had grown more like family than a babysitter, would already be asleep on the couch, and I would quietly slip in beside her, my mind racing. I kept telling myself that I could make it through, that somehow things would be okay, but there were moments, late at night, when the weight of it all threatened to crush me. One such night, as I knelt beside my own bed to pray, I found myself holding back tears. "Please, God," I whispered, "please let this Christmas be special for them. I can't give them toys, I can't give them presents, but I want them to feel loved. Please, let them feel the magic of Christmas." The morning of Christmas Eve arrived, and I was exhausted. The kids were excited, running around, talking about what Santa might bring. I smiled, trying to hide the sadness that lingered just beneath the surface. There was nothing under the tree except a few decorations I had found in the attic. But I didn't let on. I had to keep the magic alive for them for just a little while longer. As the night wore on, I put the kids to bed and sat by the dim light of a candle. I knew I couldn't go to work that night. I had no reason to leave. Instead, I quietly went down into the basement and retrieved the toys I had hidden. My heart pounded as I carefully placed them under the tree, surrounded by the few trinkets I had been able to find for decorations. There was no grand feast waiting for us, no piles of presents to open, but I hoped that the little things I had done, sewing, painting, hiding the toys, would make their Christmas a little brighter. When I finally went to bed, I lay there, listening to the sound of the children's breathing. I could hear Emma mumbling in her sleep, her tiny hands clutching at her blanket. I smiled softly, my heart swelling with love for each one of them. They may not have had the Christmas I wanted them to have, but they had me. And that was all that mattered. At that moment, I allowed myself to believe, just for a second, that there was magic in the air, that somehow, everything would be all right. And when Christmas morning came, I would see the joy on their faces, and that would be enough. That would be my Christmas miracle. It was Christmas Eve, and the chill in the air bit through my thin coat as I walked the familiar path to Ma's roadside diner. It was barely 6 o'clock, but the weight of the night seemed to have settled over everything already. The kind of quiet that wraps itself around you, making everything feel still and heavy. I had to keep moving, though. The diner was my lifeline now. No matter how tired I was, I had to make it through one more shift, no matter what. Inside, the warmth from the old, glowing jukebox mixed with the scent of fried food and stale coffee. The usual crowd was already there, settled in their worn booths and red vinyl chairs. Carl, Hank, and Joe were huddled together in the far corner, their voices low as they passed around a thermos. Carl had been driving across the Midwest for years. Hank was always full of stories, and Joe, the quietest of the bunch, had a soft spot for the kids back home. "Lucy, another cup of coffee here." Carl's gruff voice broke through my tired haze. His face was lined with exhaustion, the kind of tired you get after miles and miles on the road. But his smile was kind when he saw me. "Coming right up," I answered, my voice a little strained from lack of sleep. As I poured the coffee into his chipped mug, Hank looked up from his menu. "You hanging in there, Lucy?" he asked. I could tell he meant it. He wasn't just asking to fill the silence. "I'm fine, Hank," I said, forcing a smile. I didn't have the energy to explain that my shift was the least of my worries. The kids were at home, probably still waiting for Santa. But the truth was, I hadn't had a chance to even think about anything other than getting through the night. Behind me, the door swung open, and Sheriff Rick strolled in, tipping his hat to me with a friendly nod. "Evenin', Lucy," he said, sliding into a booth near the window. "Evening, Sheriff," I replied, trying to sound upbeat. He was a regular at the diner, often stopping by after long shifts. And although we weren't exactly friends, there was a familiarity between us that felt comforting in the quiet of the night. The diner wasn't busy, but there was always chatter, the sound of truckers talking shop, the occasional laugh from the musicians who had come in after their gig, winding down with a cup of coffee before heading home. The conversation flowed around me like a lifeline, and I clung to it, trying to keep my mind from drifting too far. I didn't have the luxury of zoning out. I had to keep moving. I had to keep pretending everything was okay. Around midnight, the small town of Copper Hill seemed to go to sleep. The traffic on the road outside slowed. The usual hum of life quieted down. But inside Ma's diner, we were still going. The jukebox was playing softly in the background, and I felt the weight of the hours pressing down on me as I wiped down the counters and tried to keep my energy up. The kids were on my mind, of course. The presents still hidden away in the basement. I hadn't told anyone, not even Clara, about the little toys I had painted and tucked away under the tree. By the time the clock hit 4 a.m., I felt like I could barely stand. I just needed to make it through a few more hours. I had to get through the shift, get home, and sneak the presents under the tree before the kids woke up. That was my plan. It was a small thing, but it was all I could do to make Christmas feel special for them. "Hey, Lucy," Hank called out as I refilled his coffee cup. "You get the chance to see your family today?" I hesitated, not wanting to burden anyone with my problems. "Oh yeah," I said, forcing another smile. They're doing great. Just waiting for Santa, you know how it is. Carl and Joe exchanged glances, but neither of them pressed further. They knew the routine. I was just trying to make it through. By the time my shift finally ended, I was exhausted, but my mind was set. I said my goodbyes, locked the doors behind me, and walked out into the cold, the air sharp against my skin. The sky was still dark, the moon hanging low, and the streets were empty. The world felt frozen in time. I made my way to the old Plymouth, my footsteps echoing on the empty street. I just needed to get home, get the toys under the tree. But when I reached the car, something stopped me in my tracks. The back seat was full, packed with boxes, stacked high. I blinked, unsure of what I was seeing. My heart raced as I walked closer, the reality of the situation hitting me like a ton of bricks. There in the car was everything I had prayed for, gifts, food, everything. Boxes full of canned goods, a ham, bags of potatoes, even a few cans of paint. There were clothes for the kids, food for dinner, and toys, real toys, wrapped in festive paper. I stood frozen for a moment, not sure if I was dreaming or if this was real. I opened the door slowly, my hands shaking. It was true. It wasn't a trick. The car was full of everything I needed and more. A Christmas miracle. Tears welled up in my eyes as I sank down into the seat. There was no note, no explanation. Just the overwhelming feeling of something bigger than me at work. Some part of me wondered if the angels who had taken care of my tires had returned to leave me this gift. "Thank you," I whispered, staring at the boxes. "Thank you." I knew I couldn't wait. The kids were expecting me to come home and sneak the presents under the tree. As quietly as I could, I began to pull the boxes from the back seat and carry them into the house. The weight of each box was a reminder that somehow, against all odds, everything was going to be okay. When I finally tiptoed into the house, the kids were still asleep, their little faces peaceful and unaware of the miracle that had just arrived. I set the presents under the tree, taking care to arrange them carefully. Then I stood back and watched the soft glow of the Christmas tree lights. I felt a warmth spread through me, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove or the lights on the tree. It was the warmth of knowing that, somehow, I wasn't alone. That, no matter how difficult things had been, there was still hope. As I sat down on the couch and closed my eyes for the first time in hours, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The night had been long, but now it was worth it. Tomorrow, Christmas morning, the kids would wake up to a miracle. I opened the door to the Plymouth, feeling the cold bite of the winter air, and slid into the driver's seat. My heart was heavy with exhaustion, but there was still that glimmer of hope, the hope that I could make this Christmas a little brighter for my children, despite everything. But when I turned the key in the ignition, a strange feeling washed over me. There was something off. I looked over at the back seat, and then my eyes widened in disbelief. The car, our old, beat-up Plymouth, was packed to the brim with boxes of every shape and size. It was as if someone had filled it with all the things I had been praying for, all the things I couldn't afford, all the things I hadn't dared to hope for. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle and swung it open. There they were, stacked neatly in the back seat. Boxes of clothes, jeans, shirts, jackets. Groceries, bags of potatoes, cans of vegetables, a ham. And candy, lots of it. There were bags of chocolates and candy canes, things I could only dream of being able to afford. And as my eyes wandered to the front seat, there it was, an enormous ham wrapped in butcher paper, sitting perfectly on the passenger side, like it had been placed there just for us. But that wasn't all. I reached for one of the boxes, my hands shaking with disbelief. The moment I opened it, I saw them. 5 toy trucks, each one better than the last, their shiny paint gleaming in the soft light of the street lamp. And then, nestled carefully between the toys, was a doll. A beautiful, soft, lifelike doll. The kind I had imagined for my little girl. The kind I knew would make her smile like she had never smiled before. I could hardly believe my eyes. Where did this all come from? I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. I had no idea. There was no note, no explanation. Just a car full of gifts, a Christmas miracle I couldn't wrap my head around. I looked up at the dark sky, still filled with stars, and whispered a prayer of thanks. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," I murmured. I had no idea who had done this, or why, but I knew one thing for sure. Someone had given us everything we needed for Christmas. And it was a gift beyond anything I could have hoped for. I wiped the tears that had welled up in my eyes. I had to hurry. I couldn't waste a single second. My children were waiting at home, and I needed to make sure they had a Christmas they would never forget. I couldn't let them see me cry, not yet. Not until they were old enough to understand the magnitude of this moment. With trembling hands, I started the engine, and the old Plymouth rumbled to life. The road ahead seemed endless, but the rising sun cast a soft glow over everything, a promise of a new day. As I drove, the weight of everything, the long hours, the struggle, the exhaustion, began to melt away. The air seemed warmer, the world seemed kinder, and for the first time in a long while, I felt hope surge through me. I couldn't help it. I sobbed, tears streaming down my face as I gripped the steering wheel. There was no stopping it. I had been so scared that we wouldn't make it, that my children wouldn't have enough. But now, here I was, driving back home with more than I could have ever imagined. I felt like I had been carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, and now, somehow, everything was different. "Thank you," I whispered again and again, as if saying the words could somehow convey the depth of my gratitude. As I turned onto our street, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light across the neighborhood. The trees that lined the road seemed to sparkle in the early morning light, like something out of a dream. And I knew that this would be a Christmas like no other, a Christmas we would never forget. I parked the car quickly and, with my heart pounding, rushed inside. The house was quiet, so quiet that I could hear the soft sound of my children breathing as they slept in their rooms. I crept down the hallway and into the basement, where I had hidden the little toys I'd been painting. I gathered them up carefully, along with the new gifts, and carried them into the living room. I arranged them under the small tree we had found, the one I had picked out with my children a few weeks ago, and I took a step back. It wasn't much, but it was everything. For the first time in a long while, the Christmas tree looked full, like it had the magic I had always hoped for. I looked down at the gifts and smiled through my tears. There was candy, there were toys, there was food, everything I had dreamed of giving them. But more than that, there was love, there was hope. There was the realization that even in the hardest times, there were people out there who cared. People who didn't know us, but somehow knew exactly what we needed. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just a fluke. It was a miracle. The kids stirred in their beds as I was finishing, and I paused for a moment, holding my breath. The excitement was building inside me, and I couldn't wait to see their faces when they saw the gifts. I just couldn't wait to share this moment with them, to show them that Christmas wasn't about what we didn't have, but about what we had, and what we could give each other. As the morning light streamed through the window, I heard the soft patter of little feet, and then a voice calling out from the other room. "Mom, is it Christmas? Can we go see?" I smiled, my heart full, and whispered to myself once more, "Thank you." I opened the door to the living room, and there they were, my children, their faces lighting up in disbelief as they saw the gifts under the tree. It was as if the magic of Christmas had come alive in front of them, and I knew in that moment that this would be a day they would remember for the rest of their lives. There were angels, I realized. They had been working through the kindness of strangers, through the people at Ma's roadside diner, through the people who had given us more than we could have imagined. And somehow, on that Christmas day, I felt like the luckiest mother in the world. Friends, subscribe to my channel. There are many more interesting stories like this. Do listen to them too, and thank you for listening to this story.